This Netgate SG-5100 was sitting on the shelf at a customer site. Apparently it didn't work. Nobody really knew what was wrong with it. But my coworker knew that if there was even a chance of bringing it back to life, I'd probably want it for my home lab. So naturally, I decided to rebuild my entire network around this thing. My home lab has been slowly getting more serious. Originally, my plan was to take an old Pentium G3220 system and turn that into my router, which honestly would have worked, but then this Netgate SG-5100 basically fell into my lap. And suddenly my sketchy DIY router plan started looking a lot less appealing. I mean, I've got some pretty serious services running, at least for a home lab. Jellyfin, image, game servers, storage, and at some point I realized I was relying on the ISP router for basically everything, which probably wasn't the best long-term plan. So when the supposedly broken Netgate SG-5100 showed up, I figured this might finally be my excuse to start taking control of my network properly. There was just one small problem. Before I even got my hands on it, my coworker had already plugged into the LAN port to see if it was still alive. Nothing. No IP address, no web interface. The thing basically wasn't talking to his computer at all. So at that point, we genuinely had no idea if this thing was recoverable or not. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. This was my first time ever using a serial console connection. My first time using PuTTY. And honestly, this whole thing immediately felt way more enterprise than anything I'd messed with before. Which was pretty cool, but also kind of terrifying. This was the moment that I realized that I was leaving consumer router territory. Now, I was messing with actual network appliances. But eventually, I got in. And somehow, this thing was actually alive. At first, I figured I'd just install the operating system onto the built-in eMMC storage and call it a day. That plan did not last very long. I ran into install problems almost immediately. And after fighting with it for a while, I started to realize that this is probably the reason why it ended up on the shelf in the first place. Eventually, I got the operating system running on a USB thumb drive, but getting to that point was kind of ridiculous. At one point, I had two USB drives plugged into the box at the same time, except the ports are so close together on this box that they didn't physically fit. So, I ended up taking the plastic housing off of one of the drives and plugging in a completely exposed USB PCB just so the installer drive could fit next to it, which felt extremely questionable, but technically it worked, which at least proves the box still did Firewall things. And the second I realized that this thing was actually usable, I immediately went on Amazon and bought the cheapest SATA M.2 SSD I could find that didn't look like a complete scam. So, thankfully, this box had another option for storage. And honestly, using random spare hardware and bargain bin parts to keep old enterprise gear alive is becoming kind of a theme around here. At this point, the Firewall was already technically working from the USB drive, which honestly felt kind of ridiculous for something that was about to run my entire home network. So, once the SATA drive showed up, I moved the install over properly. And thankfully, this part actually went pretty smoothly. The Firewall booted correctly, the web interface came up, and for the first time, this whole project actually started feeling real, which was both exciting and slightly concerning considering I was about to replace the router my entire house depended on. Once the Firewall was up and running, it was finally time to migrate the network. And honestly, this is the part that I was the most nervous about, because now it wasn't just a cool piece of hardware sitting on my desk. Now it was responsible for my entire house. I moved over the static IP assignments from my Spectrum router, set up the Omada access point, and started slowly bringing the home lab back online, piece by piece. And somehow it all just actually worked. This setup still has a long way to go. I want VLANs, better segmentation, VPN access, more services, probably more questionable hardware decisions. But this feels like a pretty major step in the home lab. Not just adding another server, but actually building real infrastructure. Honestly, I think my favorite part of this hobby is taking hardware that somebody else gave up on and figuring out how to make it useful again. This Firewall was sitting on a shelf because somebody thought it was dead. Now, it's running my entire network. And yeah, I'm still learning as I go. Half the time I'm figuring things out 5 minutes before I start filming. But honestly, that's kind of what makes this stuff fun. It ain't gotta be pretty, it's just gotta work.